Tyson Foods had a rough second quarter, posting a $97 million loss, way off of expectations. There's also a lot of new details regarding that major flight training military mission coming to Fort Smith. Talk Business and Politics Executive Editor Michael Tilley and I caught up to talk business. Joining me now, Talk Business and Politics Executive Editor Michael Tilley. Always good to be with you. Thanks for joining us, sir.
You're welcome.
Let's begin with some tough news. Tyson Foods this past week announces their, I think it was their second quarter earnings, a $97 million loss. This was quite unexpected in terms of where people thought earnings guidance would be. But it does explain why they are shutting down some facilities, including one in Van Buren near you, as well as laying off some corporate jobs, which we were all scratching our heads about some of those reductions. What's your take on the earnings report?
Well, it wasn't just a little bit below estimates. It was way below estimates, and the market has punished them. Their stock fell below $50 a share. The $97 million loss. Keep in mind, they made a little over $800 million in the same quarter last year. So you're almost looking at a cool $1 billion swing year over year. But yes, they closed, the production facility in Glen Falls, Virginia, the large production facility here in Van Buren, where almost 1,000 people were laid off. They're consolidating their corporate offices. They announced layoffs there. Our calculations show about a roughly 20% fewer jobs, corporate jobs in Springdale than this time last year. And I'm not sure they're finished cutting, closing plants, consolidating operations. Their beef business, I think their poultry business will recover. I think they've got that on a recovery track. It's the beef sector that's going to be a problem for a while because there's some factors in the beef sector they can't control: beef demand, beef supply, slaughter prices. So that's going to weigh on them for a while. Roby, the one thing I was surprised that analysts, even though it was a tough quarter, one of the toughest I've seen, analysts are optimistic about their long-term prospects. So I haven't seen the stock recover yet to maybe justify or show some of that optimism in the market, but the equity analysts who follow them are somewhat optimistic.
Well, they are one of the biggest players on the scene, and people do have to eat chicken, beef, and pork and prepared foods. So that might explain some of that optimism. You mentioned the fundamentals in that beef business, but some of those factors that you talked about, demand, commodity prices, all of those things that kind of go into inputs, those are also affecting pork and chicken. Tell me what you kind of see when you look at the segment analysis on that.
Well, the inputs primarily, we're talking about the feed costs, especially on the poultry side. So the wheat, the grain, all of those, and we've seen those continue to be high globally. We may not feel the effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we can see them to some extent on these kind of operations, local operations. One other thing on the segment, the prepared food segment continues to perform well. I've been in this business long enough to remember back when the Tyson family said they were going to kind of break out of just being a commodity business and buy prepared foods, packaged foods, and they bought Hillshire and all of that. And there are a lot of us scratching their heads thinking, what do they know what they're doing? Well, apparently they did. So because that's worked out, it's still working out well for them.
You had a great series of stories on kind of the backstory of how Fort Smith landed this big military mission that it has gotten in terms of the flight training program. I want you to tell everybody a little bit of maybe from the 10,000 foot level, no pun intended, but just what were the key kind of turning points that you've learned that really cemented the deal for Fort Smith, because they were not in first place according to your reporting.
No, not only were they in first place, but after they visited Fort Smith in February of this year, the Singapore delegation told some folks in Fort Smith that, we were just coming here for a courtesy visit. We had no intention to come to Fort Smith, but you've changed our mind. And some key things that you talked about, some key things were in no particular order. There was an issue with the runway length, and it wasn't a deal killer type issue. But when the Singapore delegation looked at Fort Smith runway, which is up to NATO standards, it's over 8,000 feet, and said something about could we lengthen that. Governor Hutchinson was at that dinner meeting in Fort Smith, and essentially said, "We'll make it happen." And within 2 weeks, there was a contract to extend that runway another 1,300 feet. That impressed him. Then there's this lady up in Northwest Arkansas. Her name's Alice Walton. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's got a little museum up there. But she agreed. Congressman Womack, Representative Womack from 3rd District, called her up. So we have this delegation coming to town. We want to bring them by the museum. And she essentially said, "You let me know what I need to do and I'll do it." And he said, "Well, can you host them?" And so she did. And one interesting connection is that the architect who built Crystal Bridges, who designed Crystal Bridges, has developed and designed some of the more iconic structures in Singapore, the airport, the casino operations, some of the museums there. He's a rock star in Singapore, and she knows him firsthand. And so she had a relationship that she could talk to them about that. And then the other thing is they had an air war. They brought in some military units from Dallas, Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Kansas, Missouri to create this air war above Fort Smith. And they were able to see it. Again, they were here in February, and they got lucky with the weather. It was 70 plus degrees, not a cloud in the sky, and they could see this air war. They could see these F-16s strafing the Razorback Range there just at Fort Chaffee, just outside of Fort Smith. And so that they were impressed with that. The city of Fort Smith, a dealership, provided a whole bunch of SUVs. They had the Singapore and American flag on them. The Fort Smith Police Department escorted them like they were a president through town, and that nobody had ever done that for them. So I think it was just a series of those things got their attention. And there's some practical things that go into it in terms of the benefits of the Ebbing Air National Guard base at Fort Smith. But they ended up getting, as we all now know, they got the record decision to bring the training center here.
Sometimes you need skill, sometimes you need luck, sometimes you need a little bit of both. So good weather, you can never discount that. So
as you and I always say, sometimes relationships do matter.
Yeah. All right. So lastly, the tourism ticker that we produce, that you spearhead, is out. It shows Arkansas's tourism numbers continue to accelerate. I think we're up about close to 16% over last year's tourism tax collections, which signals a very, very robust and strong outdoor and recreational economy in Arkansas. What do the numbers tell you when you've been drilling down in them?
Yeah, and keep in mind, these double-digit increases in the tourism tax and in the hospitality tax collections of the 17 cities we survey, they're up against what were very healthy numbers last year. So you could be forgiven for if it was just a 2 or 3% increase, thinking, well, they're still doing pretty good. But frankly, I was surprised that the January, February numbers came in so strong. The 17 cities we survey, their combined hospitality tax revenue was up 15.7%. On the jobs front, the tourism sector jobs were up almost 5% in January, February compared to last January, February. So a good, healthy number. Roby, it would have to take a very broad, broad economic downturn to slow it down. There's just a lot of momentum behind it, and all of the anecdotal evidence you see, that you hear from economists, they continue to talk about how people are continue to move toward the experience economy, and instead of buying goods, they're buying services, they're buying experiences. So that bodes well for Arkansas's tourism industry.
That's Michael Tilley, Executive Editor for Talk Business and Politics. You can read more on the stories that we discussed at talkbusiness.net. Final thoughts when we return.